So I'm here to introduce Professor Igor Mekjavic from Slovenia, who's been doing work on planetary habitation. And that work is physiology, and it's showing how important physiology is going to be for the future of our species, as well as giving us lots of useful information with people with a range of medical conditions.
Hi, my name is Igor Mekjavic. I'm from Slovenia, working at the Jožef Stefan Institute. My area of research is environmental physiology.
So can you tell us a little bit about your current research?
Yes, for the past few years we've been dealing with space life sciences. In particular, I'm looking at the effect of simulated weightlessness on various physiological systems. We simulate on Earth the effects of weightlessness by actually using the bed rest experimental model, which means we render people inactive and place them in a horizontal position in beds for extended periods of time, and look at the process of deconditioning in all the physiological systems. So we're looking at muscle atrophy, bone loss, changes in metabolism, and so forth.
And so what's the purpose of the research?
What we've tried to do is to understand the problems that future astronauts will experience in the proposed planetary habitats. Now, the problem that exists now is that we're not quite sure what kind of atmosphere we have to maintain in future planetary habitats. Our experience now is that astronauts living on the space station are in a normal temperature, pressure, humidity environment, but they of course lack gravity. So when they do extravehicular activities, which is approximately on average once per month, they have to don a spacesuit in which they reduce the pressure. And in order to prevent decompression sickness, the pressure reduction is very slow and they breathe oxygen. This procedure lasts several hours, which is not a problem. This is done on a monthly basis. However, in future, when astronauts will be exploring the Moon and Mars, they will be traveling in rovers, and they will obviously wish to explore the surface more frequently than once a month. In fact, it might be a daily event. So this several-hour procedure will have to be conducted on a daily basis or even several times per day. Now, this decompression, because it's lengthy, is logistically impractical, and in fact repeated decompression such as this might actually have a cumulative effect which might be detrimental to the astronauts. In other words, it might cause decompression sickness. So the engineers and life scientists at NASA and ESA have decided that one option would be to reduce the pressure and also increase the oxygen level. So as a result of this, the partial pressure of oxygen in this environment will be hypoxic, similar to the altitude between 2,000 and 4,000 meters. The exact level of the partial pressure of oxygen is as yet not known.
So a new aspect to this from the physiological perspective is the combination of bed rest and hypoxia.
So the question is, how does this hypoxia that they anticipate in future habitats affect the known effects of weightlessness on physiological systems? So in other words, for the last 40, 50 years, we've been investigating how weightlessness affects physiological systems, and on Earth we simulate the effects of weightlessness in space by rendering subjects bedridden. It's called the bed rest experimental model. Subjects are in bed, and what we know is that for a given length of time, the effect of weightlessness on the muscles or the heart, bones, and so forth is exactly the same as if they would be bedridden on Earth. So this model has been validated and is used to also evaluate different procedures known as countermeasures to prevent such changes to occur. So the PlanHab project, which involved several laboratories from all over Europe, focused on the effects of hypoxia on the process of, let's say, muscle atrophy, bone loss, changes in metabolism, cardiovascular deconditioning, and so forth.
So I'm a volunteer for one of your studies. What does that involve me doing?
The volunteers for these experiments were usually healthy young males and females between 20 and 30. Individuals volunteering for this experiment undergo extensive medical examinations, interviews with medical staff, researchers, dietitians, and following a careful screening, we basically choose a pool of subjects which are then invited to the actual facility to see where the test will be conducted. They're introduced to the different equipment, experimental trials, and so forth, and they can ask questions. After a few days there, the scientists and the staff do a short list of subjects who they think would be most appropriate. And once we have a group of subjects, they are later invited to come and participate in the project. The subjects that are actually chosen spend about a week before the simulations in the facility doing a series of tests of their function and structure of physiological systems before the intervention. Then we enter the intervention phase, which is the bed rest phase. This may last from 10 days to 60 days. In Slovenia, we've conducted studies that have lasted 35 days maximum. And during this time, the rooms they stay in are basically converted into intensive care units. They are in bed, they are under constant 24/7 supervision by medical staff, and of course they're monitored, they have tests during these interventions, and then when the actual bed rest intervention is completed, they remain in the facility for another week, and the first few days again are dedicated to testing the structure and function of various physiological systems so that the comparison could be made before and after. During this time, of course, the subjects are, if you like, pampered. They have everything they need, but they have to be confined basically to the floor of this facility where we actually can simulate a hypoxic environment under constant medical care. The results of our experiments are many. I should emphasize that the PlanHab project involved more than 12 laboratories from different countries, and so each laboratory focused on one area of research, whether it was, for example, metabolism, mitochondrial function, oxygen uptake, exercise performance, muscle strength, and so forth. So each lab looked at a particular physiological function, and all these results have been published. There isn't a uniform effect of hypoxia on all these systems. I would say that in general, we found that hypoxia didn't have an extraordinary effect, but it did have an effect on some systems. The other thing that I can mention is that in some systems it would appear that if you do a short-term study, you might find that there's a benefit of hypoxia, for example, maybe in mitochondrial function, but in long term you don't see that. So there could be different phases of an effect. But what we found is that, for example, with cardiorespiratory function, that during exercise, you would see that basically hypoxia exaggerates the effects you would see in normoxic bed rest. In terms of muscle atrophy, again, we found that in some muscle groups, the muscle wasting might be exaggerated in hypoxia, in other muscle groups it may not. So there is a variety of effects, but this is the interesting part. The next step is trying to integrate all this information to try to understand the overall effect of living in a hypoxic environment with reduced gravity.
So how important is this physiology research for the future of our species?
Well, the European Space Agency, for a start, will not fund any research that does not have immediate benefit to humans on Earth. That's very important to state. So what we're doing is not of relevance only to the few astronauts who in the next decade or two or three might visit the moon and Mars. But what we've discovered is that the hypoxic inactive experimental model is quite interesting as it simulates basically what we see in many populations on Earth. So for example, patients suffering from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease are inactive due to hypoxia. In obesity, we have individuals who have a lot of their tissue which are hypoxic, and because of the mass, they're also inactive. Vascular patients and so forth. So there are many patients where we see the presence of hypoxia and inactivity, and this experimental model allows us to understand the process that is ongoing in these patients. For the survival of the species, that's a much wider question, but of course, if we are going to establish settlements on Mars and the moon, then we have to understand how this can be achieved and what effects this might have on humans doing that. So this is, from that perspective, important.
Absolutely. If we're going to inhabit other planets, then an understanding of the physiology is an absolute essential precursor to being able to do that. So physiology becomes pivotal in terms of that exploration, and at the same time, you're learning an awful lot about people who find themselves in situations where they've got bed rest and hypoxia combined.
I often use the example of James Lynch, who in fact did the first controlled medical study where he proved that in order to avoid scurvy, you have to actually eat citrus fruit. And we know now it's because of the vitamin C. So here was someone who was investigating a problem for basically the mariners that were going out to sea, exploring the world and new continents. And as a consequence, benefited all of humanity,
Yep.
not just the sailors going out, because this was not known. And in the same sense now, we are investigating how to help a few astronauts exploring the universe or looking for where we can settle. But in the process of doing this, we are actually providing more knowledge for patient populations or for humans on Earth, and that's the important part.